What's up, guys? Hey, it's Jonathan, and listen, I got to apologize. This topic that I'm going to talk about today has completely derailed kind of my video production for the week. So I haven't posted anything in a week, and I apologize for that because this is a pretty sensitive topic, and it's one that a lot of people won't venture into talking about. And so I'm not afraid to go there. So let's go there, because at the end of the day, I want to help you really, and your athlete, get to the best of their ability, get as far down this athletic path as they possibly can, and understand like all the hurdles along the way. And one of the things that I do that a lot of people don't do is I talk about the things that a lot of people don't want to talk about because they don't want to bring up maybe a sensitive topic. So today, this is really sensitive. So I got an email from one of the moms of one of my athletes, and that athlete is on an Olympic track. So their sport has the Olympics as part of their outcome, okay? And the reason why I say it like that is sometimes Olympic sports, that's all they have. Sometimes some sports don't have an Olympic track, but everybody gets inspired about the Olympics and thinks that, wow, at the Olympic level, things must be just perfect. And I grew up with that philosophy. Like when I got into sports and I got into my Olympic track, I just felt like all the people that were on that path were like the best possible people for those jobs. And a lot of times they were, but a lot of times they weren't. And so the question that this mom wrote me was relating to a situation that happened with USA Gymnastics this past week, where they suspended another coach for 8 years. So the coach's name is Maggie Haney. Now, I don't necessarily like to use the name Maggie. I don't know Maggie. I feel like that's a pretty personal name, but like when you look at all the articles about Maggie, her name is Maggie. It's not Margaret or anything like that. So I don't want you to think that I know her. I have no relationship with her whatsoever. I'm looking at this. I've looked at like 12 articles on this situation. And so what I know about Maggie is that she's a very successful USA Gymnastics coach. She runs a gym in New Jersey. She trains lots of athletes, and I believe she's had an athlete on the national team or the Olympic team for the last 6 or 8 years. So that's a pretty high level of success as a coach in any sport, I would argue. Now, the question from the mom of my athlete was how does something like this happen at this level? Right? And so what happened was that Maggie Haney has been suspended for verbally abusing, emotionally abusing her athletes, and also maybe physically abusing her athletes. So I want to talk about those things today. And again, I'm going to start out by saying, in no way, shape, or form am I acknowledging or accepting, or what's the word I'm looking for here? Endorsing physical or verbal or emotional abuse, okay, to any athlete at any age. And so I want to start by saying that. I also want to say that claims by athletes against their coach at this level get really serious, okay? But what I want to talk today about is how these things happen at this level, because for some of the athletes involved here, this coach has been working with them for a pretty long time. And what I would say is a pretty long time is more than a year, maybe 2 years. Anything longer than that, there's a relationship there. All right. Now, what I wanted to talk about today is, all right, so the question from the mom was how does this happen at this level? And could it happen, what she was really asking me was could this happen at her athlete's level or on her athlete's path? And my answer was, well, yeah. And you would be naive to think that it couldn't. But I want to start with an interesting topic here, right? So why does something like this happen? So one of the reasons this happens is that a relationship between a coach and an athlete is about elite performance. And in a sport like gymnastics, there are judges, there are certain scores, there's a standard for performance that even the youngest athlete knows that they're trying to reach that. There's no real exception to that. It's not let's say a team sport like hockey or soccer or lacrosse or any of those sports where you can come into it and really kind of blaze a path. You can blaze a path in gymnastics, but that's after you reach a certain standard, okay? And so what happens here is the coach-athlete relationship is one where a lot of times a coach will have more interaction with an athlete, with a child or a person, than they have with their own parent, which is kind of hard to digest. A lot of parents think, well, that's not true. But sometimes, coaches will have more intimate conversations with their athletes than a parent has with that same athlete, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but it happens. All right, so why do we get to this level? Well, here's what happens, is that along the pathway, parents and athletes will seek out like elite coaches to help their athlete get to the next level. And sometimes this is a mistake because some athletes are in a good club or a good program, things are progressing nicely, but the parent and the athlete, they're getting impatient and they think, oh, I need to be with that coach or that club to really get better. And in gymnastics, that's commonplace because your athlete could be in some rural town or part of your city where you're in a good club, a nice club, the coaches are nice, but then you're looking at this other club that has an Olympian or a national champion and you want to naturally go there. It's just part of the business. So parents and athletes seek out what they perceive as those higher level coaches. The problem is that those coaches have abilities too. And your athlete may need more nurturing, more sensitivity. Because what happens is as you go further up the food chain, the demand on results is higher and higher, right? So if you can't meet a standard, then you're not really helping that club. You're actually, you could be a bad mark on that club because in this case, club gymnastics is a business, as most programs are, right? Most travel teams are a business. If they're not pulling great results, you can only get so far because what will happen is you'll constantly lose your best athletes to more competitive clubs. But at those more competitive clubs, the demand on results is higher and those coaches are not always kind of the lovey-dovey, lovey-up sort of type, okay? So you got to be prepared for that. But in this case, what happens is there's a breakdown in what I call performance expectation. So even at the highest level, even at the Olympic level, a coach may look at their athlete and the coach is human too. Let's all remember that. The coach is human. They have their own issues. They have their own demands. They're adults typically, and the athletes are not necessarily adults at this point, okay? But what happens is there's a performance expectation breakdown. And it can go both ways. The athlete can feel like the coach isn't leading them in the right direction, or the coach may feel that the athlete is no longer at that same level of drive or dedication or things along those lines. So what happens there is that the performance level, the score in this case for gymnastic athlete, is not acceptable to the coach, or it may be not acceptable to the athlete, right? So that starts a little bit of a rift, okay? Now what that causes is usually some tough conversations either way. Most of the time it goes from the coach to the athlete. Athletes, in my opinion, rarely confront a coach because they're nervous. They respect the coach. They respect maybe the potential a coach will give them, although that's not always necessarily, that can be blown out of proportion. A lot of people think, a lot of coaches will dictate, they'll create this persona like that the only way that you will have success is if you're with them. And I don't like that approach. I don't condone that approach, but sometimes it can happen there. And so what happens now is that there's a rift between the communication and then therefore the relationship between the coach and the athlete. Now, what happens, well, that can vary. But in this particular case, the first accusations that I saw were all about verbal abuse, okay, and emotional abuse. And again, not condoning anything. I don't know what she said or how she said it, but I'll start by saying this, that most times coach-athlete relationships are inherently verbally and emotionally abusive, right? It's all about challenging and it's all about, demanding a higher expectation and pushing and cajoling. And as a coach comes to the interaction with the athlete with a toolbox. Some coaches have a larger toolbox with more tools available to them than other coaches, right? As a coach develops, hopefully, they're developing a myriad of ways in which to encourage, prod, cajole, push that athlete to go further, okay? And that's what this is all about. That's what high performance is all about. We are constantly having athletes and pushing their limits so that we see bigger tricks and faster speeds and all that stuff. That's what it's all about, right? But how we get there, when you look at it in from the outside, it's very easy to look at a snapshot of a relationship and think, oh my God, that's horrible. When in fact, everything leading up to it was what helped that athlete actually get to that level, all right? Now that can be difficult to hear, but it's something that's important to just understand, because truly the relationship between an elite coach and an elite athlete can be perceived as somewhat abusive, right? But a coach has a certain set of skills, right? And if they lack, sometimes coaches will just jump right to the verbally abusive stuff. Like they'll challenge an athlete, they'll challenge their dedication or their toughness or their and that is part of the culture of sport. And I'm going to talk about in a minute here where values and performance meet, and to go a little bit deeper on this topic, okay? So, I remember at the 96 Olympics in Atlanta, so some of you watching me right now are probably too young to remember that, but for those of you that are a little older, you remember USA Gymnastics in 1996 in Atlanta. It's the team competition, and it's all coming down to Carrie Strug on the vault, and Bella Caroli, right, the big, strong coach, Eastern European coach, very famous in the United States. He's like, Carrie, you can do it. So she goes down, she boom, 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 runs, sprints down, hits the vault, boom, lands. And she lands short, I think, and jams her ankle. And in fact, she actually had broken her ankle, if I remember this correctly. So she falls on her face, gets a horrible score, but they get 2 vaults. And she sucks it up, right? And I can't remember how old she was at the time, 16 years old maybe. And you just see on her face, she's like, I'm not crying, I'm not gonna cry, I'm not, and that's, I'll say this, that's a trait in gymnastics. The girls in gymnastics are tough. They're taught to be tough at a very young age. They're taught to suck up that pain. They're taught to kind of hide those emotions. And again, that's part of the culture in gymnastics. Not saying it's right, it's just there. So Carrie limps back to the start for her second vault. And I remember Bella Caroli, they're going you can do it, right? And so Carrie goes down for her second vault, nails it, lands, but when she lands, she's immediately lifting her, I think it was her right or left leg, because she had broken her ankle. Now, when you look at that, America went crazy. They won the gold. It was so exciting. It was the best story of the Olympics. Those girls went on and made a lot of money, speaking and touring and things like that. But at the time, she broke her ankle. Now, was that an abusive relationship between the coach and the athlete? Should the coach have said, no, we're not going to, don't go, you're hurt? No, because the gold medal's on the line. And that's what elite sport is all about, right? That's what we're pursuing, is we're pushing limits. And we're pushing limits sometimes when we are at risk. That's part of inherently what's there. Is it right? Well, the people within elite sport at all levels will tell you it's just part of what we do. Right? The neurochemicals that flow through their body when they go through that situation is a high that cannot be replicated in so many other areas of life, which can cause issues later, but we'll get into that at a different time. But I just remember that story because you could look at that and go, oh my God, they shouldn't have made her jump. They shouldn't have made her do that vault. That's child abuse. But in that culture, it's part of it. Right? It's part of it, and it's what we love as fans, and it's sometimes it's hard for people to understand outside of that. Okay, so now one of the things that came up in this Maggie Haney story was she talked about she was accused of encouraging athletes to take off their cast when they were injured in order to train. Now, listen, we would love to have those. We would always love to have medical clearance in these situations. So again, I'm not condoning what she did because I don't know enough of the backstory, but I'm going to share a story that may give some clarification to this. And it goes something like this. So I've been around athletes who have been injured and have gone to a medical doctor, and they've been put into a cast, all right? But a cast needs you got to go back to a clinic to get that thing taken off, ideally. I mean, you can cut off a cast, I get it. But probably in this case, what they're probably referring to is more of a brace. That's what I'm thinking. And so in this case, I've seen and I've been coached where, I was injured and I was coming back to it, and the brace I was wearing was causing me to like compensate and was causing other issues to happen. And sometimes some encouragement by your coach to kind of shed that cast because you've had it on for long enough to be healed, as most people would kind of know. Sometimes that relationship between the coach and the athlete, the coach knows when the athlete is holding back. The coach knows when the athlete may be using that now as a crutch. And to break free of that, the coach may encourage you, hey, listen, let's lose that, right? And sometimes that is excellent coaching. But again, looking from outside, it can look like, oh my God, this is horrible. She's a bitch, she's mean, right? She's cruel. And when you pile on all these other things too, it's just one more, straw on the camel sort of thing, right? So I want to just encourage people to understand that sometimes along the way, when you're injured, a medical doctor, they're going to come at it as totally risk averse. High performance coaches and high performance athletes are risk seekers. And that's important to understand, okay, along your journey as an athlete, all right? So when does this happen? Like I said at the very beginning, like Maggie Haney and her athletes, they've been working together for a long time. She's led athletes to Olympic teams and national teams for a long time. She's one of the top gymnastics coaches in the country. So when does a good coach go bad, sort of thing? Well, this is where it's all about perception. And what they say in the business world is perception is reality, right? I believe this, like what you believe about a thing is more important than the thing itself. We know this from the placebo effect. But this type of rift or abuse, perhaps, basically comes when values and performance collide, right? And I did a video on this a while ago, but I'll just reinforce it here. Using a sport like gymnastics, as North American, a lot of my audience is North American, not all, but a lot of it's North American. But in gymnastics, we have Russians and Chinese and Ukrainians and Slovakians and we had the Czechoslovakians ages ago, and the East Germans, where that culture was so hard, and that culture still exists, right? So when you take your values and you immerse them in a different culture, you either adopt that culture and it changes your values, or you collide with that culture. Now, as elite coaches, great coaches look globally to learn, right? And so I would suspect that Maggie Haney, being around gymnastics for a really long time, she's been impacted by hard-nosed Eastern European coaches. And in North America, that culture, we don't like it. Parents don't like it, or I should say kids don't like it. Parents sometimes go like, hey, it's just tough love. But athletes can start to go like, whatever. But here's what happens. Coaches push performance, and athletes will push their performance to meet it until there is a collision of the athlete or the family's values. So let me give you an example. Coach says, you need to, so I've seen this one happen. Coach says, you need to stop eating. You're too fat. Athlete goes, okay, stops eating or develops like bulimia or anorexia. Is that healthy? Not at all. But if the belief and the value is there, an athlete might say, hey, I'll try that, or try it for a little while. Coach says, I want you to jump. We're going to now try a triple twisting or a quad twist. You're going to add a fourth twist to your routine. Athlete's done 3 twists till now. Things have progressed nicely. They're going to go for it. Now, they may get injured because of that. Was it the right time to do it? That's, again, it's the coach's call. It's the performance call. But then if the athlete says, no, I'm not going to do it, now what's happening is that they're asking to risk their self physically, right? Put themselves in harm's way, okay? Now that's a little bit more extreme. Now here's a different one. Coach says, you need to move to the Olympic Training Center. And now the family, who's always been together their entire life, they have a value decision. They're a tight family. They don't want to break up the family. Well, maybe that move is too far for them or too long for them. Or maybe the whole family moves to where that Olympic training center is. I've seen that happen, okay? Happens a lot in sports like tennis. People move countries in certain sports to get a better opportunity at performance, and their values allow them to do that, right? The whole Russian doping scandal that continues to plague us is all about values versus performance. In that country, they value performance and the freedom that performance gives them over the value of taking performance-enhancing drugs, right? So it gets complicated, but it's just where values and performance collide, all right? And so it's important to understand. So that's when this can happen. And I think I'm going to cover this a little bit. How does abuse happen? Well, again, when you take the value and performance thing, there was a quote in one of the articles I saw. It was from the lawyer representing a couple of the athletes that had filed a complaint against Maggie Haney. And the quote, I'm going to paraphrase the quote here, but it basically said, you know, we're trying to reel in the demands on hyper-competitive sports. Well, sports are inherently hyper-competitive because when you're on a global scale and you have values and performance meeting on a global scale, well, there's somebody who's always going to push the performance. Now, as a good example to this, like Simone Biles, who is very famous in the United States, African-American gymnast, she has 4 moves in the sport of gymnastics named after her. Now, what that means is that when you take an existing skill and you improve on it, so let's say there's a skill where you're doing 2 flips and you add a third or a half, or there's 3 twists and you add a fourth, then that new skill will be named after you. So there's like the Biles 2, and for instance, like the Biles 2, and you can Google that, she improved on a skill that stood for 30 years, right? That takes a huge hyper-competitive nature. Like young girls know when they first get into gymnastics and they start getting competitive about it, that maybe someday there'll be a skill named after them, right? So the quote about, reeling in hyper-competitive sport, that's not what hyper-competitive sport is about. And so again, from a values perspective, sometimes athletes will go down the path, families will go down the path pursuing elite performance and get to a point where they no longer can go forward. So the coach at that point is going to be driving that athlete forward, and the family to a degree, right? Time, energy, money, resources, and at some point, some families go, we can't do anymore. We just can't do anymore. That's okay. It's a hard discussion to have. It can be gut-wrenching to have to give up for those reasons, but does it make the sport bad? No. Does it make the athlete bad? Also no. It's just that's what we're doing here. We are pursuing elite performance, and sometimes the goalposts change, right? The finish line is further away than we were anticipating. Or something befalls us, injury, illness, anything like that, right? A value change, that's okay, right? So, but from the outside, it can look oh so horrible. And I think that sometimes can be unfair for both the athlete and the coach, okay? So what can be done about this, all right? Well, I did a video a couple weeks ago called the Athlete Mastermind, and so I encourage my athletes to have a team around them of people who can help them find elite performance. And the reason why I say it that way, finding a team of people who can help them find elite performance, is a mastermind is a group of people where the collective mind of everybody is stronger than a single mind. It was popularized in a book by Napoleon Hill called Think and Grow Rich. This idea that, hey, listen, I might be in one business, but I want a mastermind of a couple other people who might not be in my same business, but they can give me ideas to help kind of move things forward, right? So athletes should have masterminds too. In this particular case, Maggie Haney did 2 things that were a bit of a red flag. One was, and I may forget the second one, but one was she told her athletes not to tell anybody what went on in the gym. Now, I fully understand this from a protective, like I lived this growing up, especially in a sport where there are technical improvements that you want to kind of hide, right? When you have equipment that you're trying to pursue, like that can improve your performance, you don't want those secrets to get out to anybody else. So I get that. However, though, in a situation where you have an adult coach and you have like young people as athletes, making them fear about talking to like their parents, that's a big red flag to me. So I want an athlete to have an athlete mastermind, a group of people. It could be other coaches, past coaches, and what's really interesting was that this there was a coach involved here, Karen Goller, who also was part of these like the formal accusations against Maggie Haney. And I commend her for stepping up, because this can be construed as like really weird. Karen may be a coach from a competitive gym against her, Maggie Haney's gym. Like, this is just weird, right? But she stepped up. And so what that shows me is that at some point there was a conversation between parents and athletes and parents and maybe other coaches going like, hey, is this okay? Right? Is what they're doing at this gym considered normal? Because that can be helpful, but if you do have a coach who's really helping athletes push themselves and doing it in their own way, that can be a special sauce, right? That is helpful for athletes. But it's okay to feel, you want to feel confident in that. You don't necessarily want to feel like, oh my God, my coach is crazy and they're going to hurt me. Like, we don't want that. And now, unfortunately for US Gymnastics, there's been a lot of years now of coaches going overboard by a lot of intents and purposes, right? So we want our athletes to feel safe. I think baseline our athletes should feel safe. But again, I feel like even a hard driving coach can encourage that if there's the right communication, right? And a lot of times coaches resist that communication with the parents because it's like an adult having to defend their decisions to another adult. Whereas it's really easy for an adult to tell a kid, hey, do what I say, don't ask questions. And then sometimes that can be really helpful for an athlete, right? An athlete who doesn't ask too many questions can actually go further. I've seen that, I've lived that, I've had teammates like that, where if you have a trust with your coach and the coach says go, and then guess what happens? You go and you fly. And that's one of the best experiences you can possibly have. But I commend Karen Goller for being part of that, for raising these red flags. But it's important that our athletes have safe conversations. So that's one, set up an athlete mastermind. Number two, understand the motivation of the coach. So if you search on my YouTube channel or on my website, look for Coach's Abilities, I believe that's the title of it. But the coaches have abilities too, right? So athletes have abilities, coaches also have abilities. And sometimes coaches, they are really good in certain areas, like for gymnastics coaches, just use this as an example. They're great technically teaching choreography, and also they're great tactically teaching choreography, and they're great technically teaching, basically where to be in space, how to point your toes and tuck your elbows and all that stuff. Like, all those things are going to help an athlete learn and achieve the next skill. But every coach has limitations. And what I see happen a lot, which is really unfortunate, is coaches get very childlike. They get very territorial. They get very protective because they love what they do. Their sport has been their whole life, and the fear of having that taken away from them it's traumatic, right? And so they start developing sometimes these bad tendencies. Only coaches that are completely confident, and in now this day and age, it's kind of weird because even in any sport, the most confident and the most skilled coach can be turned upside down by a group of unruly parents. That is just a fact. We've seen that happen in all sorts of sports. And a lot of times it's unfortunate because the coach is really good. Sometimes it's warranted. A lot of times I don't feel it is. But that's a conversation for another day, okay? But understand where the coach is coming from. Understand that coach is there all about designing high performance athletes. Sometimes coaches are not parents yet. They're not there. They may feel like or call themselves like a parent, or they may not have kids and call all their athletes their kids. That's not, that's not the way it is. As a parent, I can tell you that's not the way it is. Your ability to coach and drive an athlete is one thing, but when there's distance, you sometimes can push an athlete further than when it's your own athlete, right? That's inherently part of it. But understand the motivation of the coach, okay? Number 3, understand the coach's abilities, okay? I just covered that. Sometimes coaches I see this a lot with young coaches where they love their sport, they are no longer able to compete competitively, but they don't want to leave the sport, so they become coaches right away to the next generation. And a lot of times what happens for those athletes is that those athletes now coaches, they still feel like they compete. I've gone through this, I live it, went through a very long time in my life and actually proved it. Proved myself competitive all the way up into my late 30s. But the thing is this, is that your athlete is going to need a toolbox. There's going to be days they need a hug. There's going to be days they need a psychologist. They need a medical doctor. They need a grandfather. They need they need their teddy, like all that stuff. They need that all in their coach. And I did a video a while ago that sometimes we're asking too much of our coaches. And so I think as a parent, you can help your athlete a ton by setting them up for a situation, knowing like this coach isn't going to love you like your last coach did. This coach is going to come at you harder and heavier than you've ever been coached before. All right. And preparing an athlete for that experience is important, because if they go in and they think this new coach at the higher level is going to be just like their old coach, it's going to blindside them. There's going to be a time of bad performance, and the athlete's going to want to quit and all that stuff. We got to get past that. Okay. And then understand that values shift that I talk about. First of all, understand that values shift. And then secondly, understand that your values may have shifted. Time away from home, boyfriends, girlfriends, money issues, time challenges, the demand to travel, sometimes you get involved in a sport and you get to a level and now all of a sudden doping has become an issue and you can see it. That is now a value choice, right? So these are things that you have to be ahead of to know that at some point your values and performance may clash, all right? And be prepared for that, okay? So listen, a longer episode today, but I hope you enjoy this one. Like I said, it took me I've shot this 5 times. I'm gonna go with this one. It delayed all my other videos because I just couldn't wrap my head around. I wanted everybody to know, listen, I'm not condoning coaches be jerks. But I will want everybody to understand that sometimes when you look at a coaching athlete situation from the outside, it can be construed or misconstrued what went on. All right, that is just a fact. So we have to all agree on that. But what went down, how it went down, we don't always know on the outside. And I'm not saying I know what happened with Maggie Haney either. I always feel bad for longtime coaches and successful coaches when something like this comes up, because I do think there's probably a lot of what she does as a coach that helps athletes reach elite performance. She has that experience, right? And that's true for a lot of coaches. But I can speak from experience working with now athletes across a variety of sports. Is there a lot of coaches out there who don't have the skills or abilities? They're good tactically, they're good technically, but when it comes down to physically or emotionally, they just don't have those skills. And to be honest, they don't want to have to deal with it either. Right? They don't want to have to go there. They want your athlete to show up and be ready to go and ready to play and coming drama-free and all that stuff. So make sure that's there too. And you know what? When you get to a point when it's time to split, sometimes splits don't have to be verbally abusive. They don't have to be acrimonious. They can be like, all right, listen, we've gone together as far as we can go, and now it's time for us to split. Okay. And I'm hopeful at that time that the coach is able to go to the athlete, I send you love and peace and all the success, go for it. I'm going to be disappointed when you're successful somewhere else. But that coach who is like territorial and angry and bitter and tries to undercut you, there's no place for coaches like that in this world, in my opinion. They're done, they're tired, they're weak mentally and emotionally, and they're not the person that's going to take your athlete and help them be successful for life, all right? And that's what I'm here about. All right, guys, listen, I hope you enjoyed this. Share this with other parents, maybe your athlete, maybe some coaches. But, it really helps me if you pass this on. So if you're watching on YouTube or wherever, hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Hit the like button, leave a comment, right? Those comments, or send a message to me privately, coachedwards@athletespecific.com. I hope that your family and your athlete is having great success, and I wish them all the best. If somewhere down the road we get to work together, that's fantastic too. But again, I love to hear what's going on in your life, and let's keep the conversation going. So don't be a stranger. See you tomorrow. Bye.